Now we remember the writer of Luke, Acts is Luke, of course, but remember who it was written to. It was written to most excellent Theophilus, presumably a dignitary, a Roman official of some sort, and he would have been reading carefully. He would have noticed that Luke, the doctor, the historian, is someone who is familiar with the intricacies of the worship of Jewish people in the first century. In fact, all of the subsequent readers of the book of Acts would have noticed that Luke has this knowledge. He must have been there. Things that were going on in the first century that were not going on in the second century and not going on in subsequent centuries. And we get a hint of that in our very first verse. So let's read it again. Acts chapter 3, verse 1. One day, Peter and John were going up to the temple at the time of prayer at 3 p.m. Now, we know that that was the evening worship that was conducted at the temple. And it was an evening service that included prayer. But Luke here is showing us that these first Christians were, as we learnt in chapter 2, devoted to prayer. But they did it also in the formal way, at church, in the temple, at the time of the evening sacrifice with its worship. And as Luke has specified, it's 3 p.m. That was the time of the evening sacrifice. And Peter and John are on their way into the temple, going through towards the inner court. So one thing we notice is that these first Christians were Jewish people, and they thought of themselves as Jewish. They're still going to the Jewish temple. Now they would have seen the sacrifices that were going on there as superficial, as superseded by Christ, but they were taking part in the daily worship and the prayer in the temple. And they're meeting there at the designated time. They've gone in the morning, and now they're coming back in the evening service, the 3 p.m. service. And the reason that they're still going to the temple is because they still understand that the temple is the place where you meet with God, where you come into the presence of God. That's what the first century Jews understood, and that's the way God had commanded it. And he commanded the temple to be built by Solomon, 957 BC. And even when that temple was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, 586 BC, it was rebuilt again in 516 BC under Zerubbabel. And then Herod the Great in 19 BC began a great overbuild of it. And that's the temple that they are entering into right now. The place where you can meet with God. And that's what believing Jews, they flock from all over the empire, the big religious festivals, to come to this place, to come to the temple. And here we are with Peter and John, Jewish people, walking they're in the outer court at this stage of our story. And the outer court was a more public area, open to Gentiles, and people could freely go into the outer court of the temple. That's where Peter and John are right now. But there was a wall that separated the outer court from the inner court, that Gentiles, that is non-Jews, were not allowed to go into. Now that wasn't a problem for our disabled man who we're going to meet here. He's Jewish himself, as we're going to see in the next chapter. But this wall that separated the Gentiles was called the wall of hostility. Wall of hostility. Now, that's not just a term that I'm just throwing out there. The Apostle Paul called it the wall of hostility. When he told the Gentile Christians at Ephesus Read with me in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 11. Therefore remember that formerly you who are Gentiles, you're not Jews, you who were once far away, have been brought near through the blood of Christ, for he himself is our peace, who has made the two one, Jew and Gentile one, and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility. What wall of hostility, Paul? This one that Peter and John are about to enter through. The one where Gentiles could not enter into the presence of God. The disciples at this stage in our story have not fully grasped the extent of the mission that Jesus spelled out for them. Remember that seminal verse that explains the whole book of Acts, chapter 1, verse 8, where Jesus told the disciples, you are my witnesses from Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. That's the nations. That's the Gentiles. Everybody, in other words. They haven't got it yet. They're still there in Jerusalem. Jesus said you're going to be going from Jerusalem, out through Judea, out from Samaria, out to the ends of the earth. They're still there in Jerusalem. And in fact, when you don't do what God tells you, he can speak to you through some pretty harsh things. Because we're going to see, by the time we get to chapter 8, they're still stuck in Jerusalem. What happens? God brings a persecution against Christianity, and they're forced to do what Jesus told them to do all along. It says that they were scattered all over the empire. Why? Because they're getting on with what God told them to do. So, in their minds at this stage, the wall of hostility between Israel and Gentiles still stands. Gentiles are out. Only the Jewish people are in. Not only in their minds, but literally there's this wall, this imposing wall of the temple, enclosing the temple of God. Try and picture how imposing it looked as Peter and John are walking up into the temple. They've reached the outer court. The temple was one of the ancient wonders of the world. The temple was so magnificent in size and appearance. Josephus, remember our Jewish historian who was right outside that temple when the Romans were going to march and try and destroy it, and did. But Josephus describes it as so magnificent that from a distance it looked like a mountain that was snow-capped because of all the marble and everything that was over the top of it. The temple was 480 metres just on the west side. Try and picture that. That means it's like half a kilometre on one side. This is how big, how magnificent the temple. This is the temple that Peter and John are seeking to enter right now. And there was this wall that cordoned off, the wall of hostility, and they are entering in through the wall of hostility through what was called the Beautiful Gate. Now, this beautiful gate was imposing. This is where this man is outside, right? Beautiful gate, beautiful, all right, but big. Try and picture it's 23 metres, like 75 feet in the old money, high, double doors. It's like massive. This beautiful gate, and Peter and John in this outer court, they're allowed to go through this beautiful gate where they can meet with God. But on the way, they meet this man. Have a look at verse 2. Now a man crippled from birth was carried to the temple gate called Beautiful. So this is the gate that separates the Gentiles from entering, the wall of hostility. And it really was a wall of hostility there was hostility actually written on it, because they actually had signs written on the wall telling any non-Jew, a foreigner, Gentile that is, that if you enter, it's going to cost you. What's it going to cost you? Well, we actually know, archaeologists have actually uncovered more than one, actually, of these signs. One discovery, 1871, and one in 1935. Archaeologists, two separate occasions, have discovered these signs that were placed on the wall of hostility. And what did it read? Well, let's have a look at what they put. The sign on the wall of hostility says that no foreigner, that's a Gentile, a non-Jew, no foreigner may enter within the barricade which surrounds the temple and enclosure. Anyone who is caught trespassing will bear personal responsibility for his ensuing death. You're going to get executed if you go beyond here. Pretty serious. Now remember, the Jews did not have the power to carry out capital punishment. Remember, the Pharisees, chief priests, had to go to Pilate to get them to execute Jesus. They didn't have the right to execute anyone. And so that was a Roman prerogative to carry out capital punishment. They made one exception. Which one do you reckon that is? So seriously did the Jews take their holy place, the meeting with God, that even the Romans allowed them to have this one exception, to be allowed to execute anyone, any non-Jew who would go beyond the wall of hostility. Anyone who would dare to enter through that beautiful gate who was not Jewish. So Peter and John approach in this outer court. They're allowed in. They can go through that gate. But even they would have to stop short. Once they got into the inner court, they would have to stop short of going into the next stage of the temple that was called the holy place. Only the priests could enter the holy place. And then at the west end of the holy place was another cordoned off section called the most holy place, or Holy of Holies, which only the high priest could enter, and only once a year. And that's what we read about in Leviticus chapter 16 before, where the most holy place could only be entered. And you saw all the intricacy of how the high priest Aaron had to be cleansed. He had to be carrying a blood sacrifice for his own sin and then for the sins of the people to go. And he could only go in there once a year, the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. That's how seriously each stage of this meeting with the presence of God was. But outside this wall of hostility, we've got this guy begging. Now, it was a good place to beg. Do good business there, because, why? If you're a pious Jew and you're on your way into the temple, it was considered a very pious act to give to the needy on your way in to worship God. So he's sitting right in front of the gate there. This will be good. Now, begging was considered to be the lowest of the low if you're a Jewish person. And so it was, what else could this guy do? He can't work, he can't walk, so he's got no other choice. There's no pension, there's no NDIS or any other such thing. What other choice does he have? Well, if he doesn't beg, he's going to starve to death. Some Jewish people said, well, better to die than beg, because it's really a humiliating thing. That's what they thought of beggars. They're outcasts. This guy is an outcast in more ways than one. And it was a mindset that was even with the disciples. Remember when we go through the Gospel of John, in John chapter 9, and Jesus and the disciples are walking past this blind man, And what did the disciples ask? They asked Jesus, who sinned? This guy or his parents? Must have been something he did. See the mindset. Jesus rebuked them, of course, but the point is that's the mindset, the attitude of a beggar or someone who is disabled in any way. It's their fault. Must be something they did. Well, now we meet this Jewish man who's been begging. Look at verse 2 with me. Now a man crippled from birth was being carried to the temple gate called Beautiful, where he was put every day to beg from those going into the temple courts. So there, Dr. Luke gives us the clinical details. The severity of the man's condition was such that he had been in this condition since birth, he tells us. And how many years was that? Well, we're going to learn in the next chapter, chapter 4, over 40 years. Over 40 years he's been in this condition. In fact, Dr. Luke notes that the condition was so severe he couldn't even limp, couldn't even hobble his own way, had to be carried to this position to get into that spot outside the Beautiful gate. How often do they carry him? The text says every day. This is his life. Every day his presumably friends or family carry him in there, dump him at the steps of the Beautiful gate, and they go on in, and he's lying out there all day, every day. Every day. Every day in front of that Beautiful gate, staring up at it. And in front of this Beautiful gate, it was beautiful. Josephus tells us that it was made of Corinthian bronze, and Josephus describes its workmanship as being so exquisite. We'll quote Josephus here. It far exceeded in value those gates that were plated with silver and set in gold. It seems to be, from most scholars' perspective, that this description is the Beautiful gate is the gate that Josephus is referring to. And remember it's how high? 23 metres, 75 feet. It's like, what, 3 times or 4 times higher than this building? You know, it's just massive structure. And here's this guy, he's staring up at it, and he's carried and sat there. There are 15 steps going up to the entrance of the Beautiful gate, and he's been laid there, maybe halfway up or at the bottom of the steps, we don't know, but he's just there on the steps. He can't climb up, he can't climb in, he can't go in, he's stuck there. And it's just an imposing restriction on this man. You see, this Beautiful gate might be beautiful to some, but to this man, it symbolises being shut out from the presence of God. Because in the Old Testament, we're told that the priests who were disabled, for instance, were not allowed to enter. Look at Leviticus 21, verse 18. No man, in the context is the priests, no man who has any defect may come near, that is, to the temple. No man who is blind or lame, disfigured or deformed. No man with a crippled foot or hand. Now, the Bible never directly excludes lay people who are disabled. That's referring to priests. But we know from the writings of the rabbis, in fact, one of the Dead Sea Scrolls discoveries, that anyone in the first century who was disabled in any way was prohibited from entering the temple. In fact, some have even interpreted, remember Mephibosheth, if you can pronounce that, say that 3 times. Mephibosheth, he's the guy who King David had sit at his table to eat, he was crippled, and he referred to himself as a dead dog, and some scholars have said that's suggesting that he was not able to go into the temple either. We don't know that for sure, how far back this reached, but certainly by the time of the first century, when this man was lying outside the beautiful gate, he was prohibited from entering through that beautiful gate, not only because he was crippled, not only because he couldn't walk in, but because he was disabled. So we read a little from Leviticus 16 before about some of the requirements. If we read right through, if you read your Old Testament and you think, what's all this strictness of, people can't do this and you've got to do that, and the ceremonial cleanliness required for God's people to enter into the temple, to enter into the worship area, everything about the Israelites' life was even what they can touch, what they can eat, what they can, how they sew their clothes, and all kinds of, all these details. What's it all about? What's it all about? It's teaching the Israelites what we need to know more of. God is holy. There is a separation between those who are clean and those who are unclean. There is a difference in pure versus sin, holy versus defiled, clean versus unclean. We look at those Old Testament details and we think, man, that's a bit over the top, even unfair. Unfair that it's some people are not allowed to. How come if you're disabled? What's that got to do with anything about knowing God? It's teaching those Israelites what we know now in far more fullness, and it's got nothing to do with whether you're physically disabled or blind or whatever now, but it was pointing to a greater spiritual reality, the New Jerusalem, where we're told there'll be no more death or mourning or crying or pain. Where Revelation 21:27 says, nothing unclean can ever enter the heavenly city, the beautiful gate that goes into the heavenly city, the future Garden of Eden that looks forward to a time when all infirmities are healed. No more pain or suffering. No more defects of mind or body. The Old Testament law restricted the priests with disability. Didn't actually say that the laid people, that had just become built up by the time this man is lying at the bottom of the beautiful gate. But it did say, to specify, we just read it in Leviticus 21. What's going on there? How come priests, I don't think I qualify with this bald patch and back and everything, I shouldn't be a priest, shouldn't be a minister. What's going on there? Well, what's going on is again the Old Testament teaching us through shadows, pointing us forward to the great high priest who was without blemish, without sin, the sinless sacrifice, the perfect. And that's why the priests went through this ritual, not really pointing in judgment about themselves, but pointing to the fact that we still need a great high priest, a mediator who did not have to, like the high priest, offer sacrifices for his own sin and then for the sins of the people, but offered himself as a perfect sacrifice because he was without sin, without blemish. So here we are in the first century, and the traditions built up that added not just the priest, but any worshipper who is disabled cannot enter. This man is permanently disabled. He is permanently shut out. He's outside the worship of God's temple. And he's outcast in every way. As a beggar, from society as someone who's disabled, and a society looks down on him as though there's something wrong with him, outside of being able to worship. Beautiful gate? Not so beautiful for him. Just an imposing barrier, a wall of hostility for this man. Do you see the magnitude of why Luke chose this particular story? He had plenty of material and events from the apostles' life, but this is not just some random, well, the apostles did this and there was a miracle performed there and blah, blah, blah. Could have chosen any one of those ones because we know there were many others that happened. No, he chose this specifically to teach Theophilus, the first reader, to teach us something. Because this story has particular things to do with the temple. There was everything to the Jewish believers of the time. And even as you just saw, the apostles themselves are still clinging on to the temple as the way in to the presence of God. And this man is not just crippled, he's excluded, therefore, from the presence of God, excluded from coming to God because he's unclean. He's out of the presence of God. Do you see the significance of how this story can speak to us? Because we know what the temple points to. We know now in hindsight from the rest of the Bible what this really means. That there is a beautiful gate, but it's not the one that was destroyed back there in AD 70. There's a beautiful gate that every single one of you will one day see and you'll face. The question is, will you be able to enter through it or not? It's an eternal gate, an eternal beautiful gate into eternal city. And nothing unclean can ever enter it. If you've got one sin clinging to you, when you face that gate, you will not be going through. Jesus said something similar in Luke's first volume, Luke chapter 13, verse 24, when Jesus said, "Make every effort to enter through the narrow door, because many, I tell you, will try to enter and will not be able to." Once the owner of the house gets up and closes the door, you will stand outside knocking and pleading, "Sir, open the door for us." But he will answer, "I don't know you or where you come from." Then you will say, "We ate and we drank with you." Hey, we took the Lord's Supper even. "And you taught in our streets. We heard your word preached." But he will reply, "I don't know you or where you come from. Away from me, all you evildoers." There will be weeping there and gnashing of teeth when you see Abraham, Isaac and Jacob and all the prophets in the kingdom of God, but you yourselves thrown out. Out. Just like this man on the outside of the beautiful gate. Only unlike this guy, it won't be like for 40 years, it'll be forever. Out. Are your sins still clinging to you? And accounting for it, that'll be your existence. Don't mess with this. There is a way. You can be assured that you can get through that beautiful gate, that eternal beautiful gate. But you can't be half in. You can't be half and half. You need to be cleansed before you can go in. Have you been cleansed? Have you come to repentance and faith? Or are you still trying to cling on to half and half? Still want to live in the world but have Jesus. There's no half and half. You're in or you're out forever. But if you will repent and believe, then the death of Jesus on the cross, what does it do? It means that he was shut out, forsaken by God, shut out so that you can go in. He becomes your substitute to cleanse you of your sin. That all who call on the name of the Lord with a true heart of repentance can go in through the beautiful gate. And what happened to our disabled man we left lying there? Well, we have to come back next week to find out what happened.